I'm making this recording as a special favor to a very long-time subscriber named Indigo Child. He has a message that he wants to send to someone about something. What it is and who it's to remains a mystery, but it's short enough and somewhat entertaining, so I have agreed to do it for Halloween as he requested. You should note that this has nothing to do with Mr. Blank or any of the deep web hacker videos. So, Indigo, this one's for you, buddy. He wants us to know that he had to lay low for a while, and his story begins. This is a story about my past. This is a story of everything that happened to me, but everything in between what I've already told you and Midnight Fears. It was a late night. I was 14 years old. I was online hacking, as what's been said in the past about me somewhere else. But that night, I was botnet hacking. And for those of you who don't know, a botnet is a collection of computers operating one computer without the user knowing. But I walked into some slaughtering, some brutal, bloody business, and they were chasing me. I was about 15 years old, and I had to move to my dad's house. I had to go somewhere else and be less known. I had been there for a year or so, but then they gave up. Instead, they sent the clowns after me. That's when they started showing up at random houses looking for me. Keep in mind you can find some of these places online, but now they're getting closer and looking for me. It was October and I was turning 16. My birthday coming up soon, and I was being chased down by the clowns. A screwed up year for me. One hell of a year for me to deal with. But I'm still running, and I need your help to stop them. Anyone, report a clown. Call the cops, and don't go after them. They are trained. They can and will kill you. Just stay inside at all possible times. And if you have children, watch them at all times. Dates are changed to protect my identity. I am older than the ages shown.
A boy was digging at the edge of the garden when he saw a big toe. He tried to pick it up, but it was stuck to something, so he gave it a good hard jerk, and it came off in his hand. Then he heard something groan and scamper away. The boy took the toe into the kitchen and showed it to his mother. "It looks nice and plump," she said. "I'll put it in the soup, and we'll have it for supper." That night his father carved the toe into 3 pieces, and they each had some. Then they did the dishes, and when it got dark, they went to bed. The boy fell asleep almost at once, but in the middle of the night, a sound woke him. It was something out in the street. It was a voice, and it was calling to him. "Where's my toe?" it groaned. When the boy heard that, he got very scared, but he thought, "It doesn't know where I am. It'll never find me." Then he heard the voice once more, only now it was closer. "Where's my toe?" The boy pulled the blankets over his head and closed his eyes. "I'll go to sleep," he thought. "When I wake up, it'll be gone." But soon he heard the back door open, and again he heard the voice. "Where is my toe?" it groaned. Then the boy heard footsteps move through the kitchen into the dining room, into the living room, in the front hall. Then slowly they climbed the stairs. Closer and closer they came. Soon they were in the upstairs hall, and now they were outside his door. "Where is my toe?" the voice groaned. The boy's door opened. Shaking with fear, he listened as the footsteps slowly moved through the dark toward his bed. Then they stopped. "Where is my toe?" the voice groaned. "You've got it!"
In the town of Bisden, nobody leaves their home after dark. As soon as the sun begins to set, shutters are drawn shut, candles are snuffed out, and doors are locked tight. Before the moon is fully risen, the entire town appears deserted, and silence reigns supreme. "Did you hear that?" whispered Freya, sounding very small and afraid in the dark. "Shut up." Her older brother Froud hissed through clenched teeth as he eyed the black windows of the house nearest to them. "They're probably locked. Nobody in their right mind will leave their windows unlocked at night. Not in Bisden, anyway." "I I told you we shouldn't play in the forest, continued Freya. I said we should go back sooner. And I said to shut up, Froud went on. Whining about the past doesn't change the present. Froud looked at his sister, shivering in the dark. It doesn't change the situation that we're in. Before Freya could respond, the faint sound of a child's laughter floated across the wind. Goosebumps erupted along Froud's neck and arms. Something about the sound seemed wrong. Maybe there's other... Froud clasped his hands round Freya's mouth. Pulling her in close, he shrank back into the shadows of the alley. Again, the unearthly sound drifted across the air. Freya tensed in Froud's arms as she realized the magnitude of the situation. A child's voice, oddly distorted, broke the silence of the night like a fist through glass. Come out, wherever you are." The thing lumbered across the mouth of the alley, just a few feet from Froud and Freya's hiding place. It was roughly the size of a child, yet shoveled with his arms hanging grotesquely close to the ground, making its disproportionate body appear markedly ape-like. It was completely nude, and had skin so shockingly white that it reflected the glow from the moon. The thing turned its shimmering bald head towards the alley as it crossed. Its face was perfectly smooth, and entirely devoid of feature, save for an impossibly wide smile with thin lips the color of blood. The crimson slash of its mouth appeared to stretch from ear to ear. Froud felt warmth spread down his thigh as its bladder let go. Freya whimpered. The thing froze mid-stride, its body becoming rigid as stone. Slowly, it turned its torso until it was facing the alleyway. It took a tentative step forward. Freya sucked in a sharp breath through her nose as she began to hyperventilate. Froud clamped his hand over her mouth, but he was too late. Impossibly fast, the thing twisted its head toward their hiding place, producing a sickening crackle from its neck. "Found you." In the town of Bisden, nobody leaves their house after dark. Every day, young ones are sternly told to be home by dusk. They are told of the evil that haunts the streets at night. They are told to always remain silent, because if they hear you, the children of the moon will tear you limb from limb.
My name is Jennifer, but most people call me Jenny. I'm a 23-year-old female from a small town in Kentucky. I grew up in a family with 3 brothers, my mother, and a plethora of stepdads, and my 2 grandparents whom we visited quite often. As a child, I remember experiencing a lot of paranormal things that I just could not explain. There are a couple of events that I remember as if they happened yesterday. For now, I will stick with the story that happened when me, my mother, and 2 of my brothers lived in a small trailer. I was about 9 years old when these events happened. Back in those days, my mother moved around a lot. My oldest brother lived with my grandparents, who never moved. But me and my other 2 brothers were dragged around from home to home, usually older trailers, and we're always changing towns and schools. In this particular trailer, I had the middle room. It was fairly small, but I was used to that, so it wasn't a problem. The problem I had with this room started maybe a few weeks after we had settled in. It was mostly at night, after everyone had gone to bed. I would be trying to fall asleep, and I would hear what sounded like someone whispering. I would be able to hear my mother and brother snoring or breathing heavily in a deep sleep, so I knew that it couldn't be them. A few times I could have sworn that someone whispered my name. It terrified me, and I tried telling my mother about it. Naturally, she told me everything was fine, and that it was probably a dream or my imagination. The whispering continued to happen, and as much as it scared me, I didn't try telling my mother anymore because I knew she would not believe me. So I braved through it, night after night. Then something else happened. Now this could be an odd coincidence of sorts. I'll let you decide, because it's fairly strange now that I look back on it. At the foot of my bed, there was a hole in my wall covered by a piece of duct tape. I never bothered it. I only ran my fingers over it to discover that it was covering the hole, and left it be. Well, one night, I woke up, and I felt very scared. It was really dark in the trailer, and I was afraid of hearing the whispers again. So I quickly jumped up out of bed, and I turned on my light. I sat in my bed for a bit, calming myself down and looking around my room to make sure nothing had been disturbed. That is when I noticed the hole in the wall had been uncovered. I looked at it, inched a little bit closer, discovering the tape that had been on it, resting on the floor. What was strange is that the tape had a few dents and maybe a small hole in it, like something had pushed it out from the other side. Again, this could well be a coincidence. Maybe a mouse pushed it out. But after that night, things started to escalate. The whispers started to die down a bit, but were replaced by other happenings. I would see what looked like a black, shadowy blur race back and forth in front of my doorway. My mom kept a very small light on at that point, so I was able to see it. Once it paused in front of my doorway, just a shadowy mass, before darting off again. I could hear my mom snoring and my two brothers deep breathing, so I knew it wasn't their shadows. That and their shadows would have casted themselves on the wall, and they would have had a human shape, unlike this. The floors were also very creaky. No matter how silently you tried to walk, the shadowy mass never made a noise. A few nights later, I began hearing scratching on my wall. I tried debunking this as best as I could. Maybe it's a mouse again, or maybe my pet turtle I had at the time had gotten out of his box. I leaned over to look in his box, and I found him there, sleeping peacefully. Okay, it had to be a mouse then, so I laid back down and I turned on my left side to find that my blanket was moving. It looked as though something was pushing it up from underneath, and it was right at the wall that the scratching was coming from. Fear gripped me as I slowly reached a hand out and swiped the covers away, looking at the small gap between my bed and the wall. I uttered a frightened gasp when I see what appeared to be a shadowy hand pulling back into the darkness. I froze for a moment, and I began to cry. I turned on my light again, and I stayed there until daylight shined through my window, exhausted. Finally, in the morning, only when the light was up, did I fall asleep. When I did wake up, I remember telling my mother about my experience. I would have as soon as it had happened, but my mother hated being woken up. And just as I thought, she once again said it was a dream, or my imagination running wild. I was frustrated. I was scared. I had to continue sleeping in that room. Around Halloween of that year, my mother purchased 2 skeletons on stands. They were bride and groom skeletons, and had buttons on their heads that you pressed to make them sing. Well, being a child and already scared of spooky things for obvious reasons, I was a bit scared of these skeletons. They were just a bit shorter than I was, and while I did think their singing was funny, they were still pretty creepy to me. It really didn't help matters when my mother decided to store them in my closet once Halloween was over. I guess we just didn't have anywhere else to put them. I objected, but it was no use, so I made sure that my closet was closed tight at all times, terrified that I would see a grinning skull peeking out at me if there were any cracks. My closet consisted of 2 sliding doors that were a bit broken, and it was challenging to get them shut all the way and to keep them that way. After the skeletons were put there, I had a few uneventful nights of peaceful sleep. No whispers, no scratching, and no shadowy masses or hands. I began to think that maybe I was just being silly. So one night, while everyone else was watching television in the living room, I decided to be brave and face my fears. I scooped up one of the 2 puppies we had just gotten and took them to my closet with me. I opened it up, and those 2 skeletons stood there, the groom in front of the bride, just as I had left them. I poked around at the groom and pressed the button on his head, giggling at his singing. After a few minutes of this and feeling slightly more at ease, I decided to move them so I could have better access to my closet. Well, that's when it happened. It was almost like it was in slow motion, as I suppose a lot of things can seem to be when you're scared. I had stepped back and was about to put my puppy down when I looked up and the groom's skeleton's hand, and I'm not kidding you about this, his hand reached out as if it were trying to grab me. What's more is that his hands, as well as the bride's, were made out of hard plastic that was really thick and could not be bent or posed. But his hand still moved. The fingers bent as they grabbed at me, as if trying to close around my arm. I went wide-eyed, and my puppy, who had also witnessed the event, yelped, jumping out of my arms and rushing to the living room as fast as his little legs could carry him. I followed suit, right after slamming the sliding doors on my closet shut. I was crying and shaking when my mother asked what had happened. I told her, and I insisted that I did not want to go back to that room. She looked slightly worried, but I could tell she still did not believe me. However, she did finally give in and let me sleep in the living room. I had to have her go get my blanket and pillow out of my room, and for the next few nights I slept in the recliner. I thought about that event over and over. I kept trying to rationalize it, but nothing I thought of would fit. I know I hadn't knocked the arm by accident, as there was a decent gap of space between me and that skeleton when I had stepped back. That and the arm had reached forward, along with the hand making the grabbing motion. That would never have been possible with me simply bumping against it. Not to mention the puppy was just as scared as I was. As a matter of fact, he never went back to my room. I don't blame him. As the nights went on, I began to miss my room. I missed my own TV and my toys that I loved playing with. I finally decided that this was the last straw. Now, my family was fairly religious, and we went to church regularly, so I believed in God. I know that not all people do, but this was the only way I knew to handle it myself, seeing as how no one else believed me. Even my grandfather had laughed at me. So I took every Bible I had, and I placed them in various parts of my room. Under my bed, next to my bed, at the foot of my bed, on my dresser, under my pillow, everywhere. Then I actually shouted at whatever had been scaring me. I told it that this was my room, and that I'm not being forced out of it anymore. I was tired of it scaring me, and I was done being pushed around. I was quite proud of myself. Then I looked at the wall and saw the hole. I had never liked it, so I took fresh duct tape and I put it over the hole. Then, being a Christian, I formed a cross out of duct tape, and I taped it on the hole as well, and even made a few more around it. It sounds silly to a lot of people, but hey, this is all I knew, and it did make me feel better and safer. After that night, I don't recall anything else happening, really. I'm still not sure what on earth it was that kept me terrified. Was it a ghost, a demon, maybe even hallucinations? I have no clue. I was never actually harmed, but who knows what could have happened if I let it go on. Maybe the scares would have just continued to escalate, or maybe more bad things could have happened. I've had experiences over the years. I think that maybe those experiences in the trailer were specific to that trailer in that bedroom. Ever since we moved, I haven't had any similar issues. And even those skeletons are in my possession still, amazingly enough. They have never moved again, and they no longer scare me. I hang them in my room for decoration, and I enjoy them now as I still love Halloween. But if I ever have children, I will be sure to listen to them if they ever tell me that anything like that is happening. I would rather be wary and discover that there really isn't anything there than to just ignore it and brush it off as my child's imagination and let them be terrified and have to deal with it on their own. I still deal with a few things like this myself, and I always have a light on at night now, and I have a cat as a companion, so I'm never fully alone. I may have beaten it, but I think I'll always be afraid of it happening again.
This story takes place in America in the early 1980s, before my mum was married. She lived with her sister's husband, and their 3 dogs. My mother's family's from Ireland, and so's my aunt's husband. His sister Mary Catherine was visiting the States for a few weeks. During the daytime, everybody worked, so it was just Mary Catherine at home with their 3 dogs, Princess, a German Shepherd / Standard Collie mix, Kelly, a German Shepherd Husky, and Mickey, a massive wolf mix. All 3 dogs were big hams, but fiercely protective. One day, my mum came home from work to find the lights turned out, shades drawn, and doors locked. She thought maybe Mary Catherine had gone for a walk, but when she opened the door, she met Mary, standing white as a sheet, with a knife in her hand. "Oh, Patsy, something terrible happened today. We had a visitor," she said. Around noon, Mary was in the kitchen fixing herself some lunch when she heard the front door open. The dogs went crazy, howling and barking. The dogs never barked at family, so she went to see who it was. It was a man she had never seen before, let himself in through the unlocked door, and was sitting on the couch. The dogs stood on the staircase landing adjacent to the couch and refused to go near him. Before she could ask who he was, he said, "I'm very thirsty. Could you give me a drink of water?" She figured he was just a neighbor, or maybe his car had broken down. The house was situated in a remote and relatively safe area, so she didn't think of him as a threat. Plus, she was from a small village where she knew everybody, and unexpected guests were the norm for her. He sat on the sofa so casually, like he was waiting for someone. She said hello and went into the kitchen to get him a drink, ushering the dogs in with her to avoid making a fuss. They were very angry, growling at the man with their hackles raised, but they hadn't approached him. She had her back turned at the kitchen sink, filling up a glass for him, when she felt a hand clap on her shoulder. "Are you waiting on someone? The family won't be home for a while. Mary said nervously. I know they won't, the man replied coldly. Mary whipped round to face the man. You know, he said, you're a good-looking woman, and I'm a good-looking man. The dogs backed up against her, barking and howling. She reached behind her to grab a knife off the block in one hand and the glass of water in the other. I think you should drink your water and be on your way. The man stood and drank the water, while Mary stood there with the dogs. She watched him place the glass on the table, open the door, go down the steps and walk into the street, until she lost sight of him. Once everyone was home, my mother called the police. There wasn't much they could do, since Mary wasn't hurt, and they hadn't heard any reports of break-ins or assaults lately, so they just took a statement. My family always tells this story as an example of how the Irish people tend to downplay unfortunate situations, almost humorously. The Irish comedian Tommy Tiernan calls this a fundamental darkness that the Irish people have. We laugh at the blackness in life, but it leaves a lot of questions unanswered. Had that man been watching the house to know everyone's schedule, knew that Mary wasn't from around here, and was going to use that to take advantage of her? Or was he just a wandering creep, looking for unlocked doors?
A little background. I grew up in the ghetto of California. I never knew my father, and my mother was a prostitute junkie, so I lived with my grandparents. We were a Mexican Roman Catholic household, and we've had the house my grandparents lived in for generations. This house has been forsaken and has had many atrocities committed in it. My father hung himself in the guest room. My great-grandmother shot her daughter, not fatally, in that house. My mother made meth in the basement for years. My brother and I were both raped in that house, and my aunt was shot in a drive-by in that house. But if you looked for any article about any of this, you won't find it. No one cared about the poor people colored in the ghetto, and I promise you, there was no God in that town. When I was 15, I shared a bedroom with my cousins. Let's call them Lupe, also 15, Maria, 19, and Tasha, 6. One night, Lupe woke up screaming this blood-curdling scream, and we all got up to check on her. She had a huge red welt the shape of a handprint on her face and was crying so hard. My grandma came into the room and hit Maria, Tasha, and I because she thought we did it, despite the hand being too big to be any of ours. We talked to Lupe after she calmed down and asked her what was wrong. She said she was having a good dream, but woke up after getting hit. The next few nights were tense, but nothing happened until a week later. Tasha was sitting at our desk, doing homework while we were just hanging out in the room. Suddenly, she started convulsing in the chair, and we ran to get our neighbor, who was an EMT. We couldn't afford a hospital, so the neighbor just put her on her side and did a few other things I didn't see because I left out of fear. After the seizure passed, she refused to tell any of us what happened. All she said was that the devil is real and he was mad. My grandparents proceeded to bless the house with holy water, burn various plants, and place twice as many crosses, Virgin Mary statues, and candles around the house. She also got our priest to bless the house. After this, we all wore rosaries and went to church as often as possible. A month went by with slamming doors, random knocks, whispers, unknown screams, bangs, and the usual poltergeist-type things. Then, Maria started to act weird. She would leave the room whenever anyone else would enter. She would mumble to herself, ditched school, and stopped showering. She would walk aimlessly around the house and never made eye contact with anyone but me. And when she did, she would look at me with disgust. One night, my uncle woke up with her staring at him in his locked room. She would bite her nails till they bled, then drip the blood into a cup. Eventually, my aunt threw away the cup of blood, and Maria got so mad she moved out. After she moved, while cleaning out her space, we found dead cats, bloody tampons, and eyes from unspecified animals. I haven't seen her since, but was told she now lives on Skid Row. This is a street inhabited by the homeless in LA, for those of you who don't know. Things kept happening to my family members in that house. An uncle started seeing his dead wife, the one who died in a drive-by. My aunt had a stillborn. My grandpa developed schizophrenia, and my brother and I started seeing a man I assume was my father. Apparitions and such began to appear to everyone. I eventually moved out at 17, not needing to become emancipated because no one really cared that I left. After I was 23, I adopted Tasha because she was molested by my grandfather and we moved far away. I still keep in touch with Tasha and we share stories about that house and our experiences. But we all agreed to never, ever go back to that house, nor talk to any family members. I swear to God, almost all of them went crazy. Tasha and I go to therapy often, but have been able to overcome the pain and suffering of that house.
Some boys and girls were at a party one night. There was a graveyard down the street, and they were talking about how scary it was. "Don't ever stand on a grave after dark," one of the boys said. "The person inside will grab you. They'll pull you under." "That's not true," one of the girls said. "It's just a superstition." "I'll give you $1 if you stand on a grave," said the boy. "A grave doesn't scare me," said the girl. "I'll do it right now." The boy handed her his knife. "Stick this knife in one of the graves," he said. "Then we'll know you were there." The graveyard was filled with shadows and was quiet as death. "There's nothing to be scared of," the girl told herself, but she was scared anyway. She picked out a grave and stood on it. Then quickly she bent over and plunged the knife into the soil and started to leave. But she couldn't get away. Something was holding her back. She tried a second time to leave, but she couldn't move. She was filled with terror. "Something has got me!" she screamed, and she fell to the ground. When she didn't come back, the others went to look for her. They found her body sprawled across the grave. Without realizing it, she had plunged the knife through her skirt and had pinned it to the ground. It was only the knife that had held her, and she died of fright.
It was Halloween of 2015. A friend of mine called me and asked me if I wanted to go with her to the haunted house that was at my town. I told her I would tag along in an hour or so. I hung up, got into my costume, and when I was ready I drove to the haunted house. I saw my friend and walked towards her. She was wearing a cute little sailor costume and I was wearing a short Harry Potter romper. We bought our tickets and waited for quite a while. It was Halloween, so of course the haunted house would be full. As our turn finally arrived, the host said that we needed 2 more people with us, because the minimum people in a group were 4. We looked around and saw 2 friends of ours. We asked them if they wanted to come in with us. They agreed and we all went in. I actually wasn't scared. I enjoyed horror movies and paranormal stuff, and so far the haunted house was okay. The attraction was located in a golf court, so part of it was inside a ballroom and the other half was outside. We finished the indoors part and were ready to head outside. As we were walking beside an old RV, my friends and I heard a hard knock. We looked around and figured that it was part of the attraction. We shrugged and kept walking. While we were walking beside a lake, a man wearing a white mask cornered me and my friend. He kept calling us pretty girls, and he even touched my thigh. We were surprised by that because right before we entered the house, the host told us that the monsters weren't allowed to touch us and vice versa. We couldn't record nor run. Immediately after the man had touched my thigh, I pushed him and we all started running. My friend turned around and screamed as the mysterious guy was chasing us, picking up our pace. I'm not a running person. I hate exercise. But I guess the adrenaline rushing through my veins helped me to finally reach the exit of the haunted house. When we turned around, there was no one. No man with a white mask chasing us. So we decided to walk towards a security guard and told him what happened. I told him that the guy touched my thigh and that I really felt uncomfortable. He asked for a description, and as my friend told him, the guard looked at us skeptically and said, "What? There's no one working here with a white mask. No one's supposed to be at the outside area." He then rolled his eyes and walked away, maybe thinking this was some sort of Halloween prank. We all went our separate ways after that, and as I was driving out I caught a glimpse of a tall man at the other side of the parking lot. The same man that cornered me and my friend. I decided not to make a big deal of it and just drove home. The haunted house is coming again next Friday, and one thing is for sure, I am not going back to that place.
Halloween 2015. Halloween night started with myself and my buddy getting ready, putting on our costumes at my buddy's house. For the sake of privacy, I will refer to him as Brad. Brad and I were invited to a party by the girl he was dating. I was going dressed as a dead construction worker, while Brad dressed up as Maverick from Top Gun. We both looked pretty dumb, as we didn't put much effort into our costumes. He was excited about seeing the girl he had just started dating, and I was equally excited to see and flirt with some chicks that night. Once we were both ready to go, we headed out. Brad's new girl sent us a text with the address attached, and we GPS'd it. Brad drove us both to the party, which was about 30 miles away, on the outskirts of our city, out in the country. We drove down a very long, dark street with no street lamps, and eventually made it to the house. The house was at the end of a long driveway, and when we pulled up, we saw a good number of cars and trucks parked out front. I'd say about 20. We were both pretty psyched, as this party looked to be awesome. Music was blaring from inside. The outside of the house was lit up with black lights and decorated with Halloween stuff, and red light was pouring out of the windows from inside. This place was a 2-story. It was very nice. It was surrounded by acres of farmland. There was not another house in sight. When we went inside, we found Brad's girl sitting on a couch in the living room, talking to 2 other people. We sat down, and Brad's girl said hello and came over to us, sitting next to Brad. She was dressed as a vampire. The 2 people she was talking to were wearing masks, one of them a guy, the other a girl. The girl was wearing a ghost face mask, and the guy was wearing just a mask with normal clothes. His mask was one of those black, blank face masks. We all talked for a while, with people rushing around us, dancing, and getting hammered. The guy was quiet. He only spoke when somebody spoke to him. I thought he was a little weird and creepy, and it didn't seem like he was having much fun. We assumed that the 2 had come together, but found out that the ghost face girl had come with 2 other girls, and the guy said he had come with his friend but couldn't find him now. After a couple hours of talking, laughing, and drinking, my vision was starting to get blurry, and I was getting pretty damn drunk. Brad and his girl had gotten off the couch and walked off somewhere, and the other 2 were still talking to each other on the couch next to me. They seemed to be flirting and having fun. At this point, I was people watching and sipping on my 5th mixed drink, Jack and Coke. I noticed that the blank face guy kept leaning his head back, and I'm pretty sure he was looking upstairs at the bedroom doors. I couldn't tell, because with his mask I couldn't see his eyes. The ghost face girl didn't seem to notice this. She was all over him and talking his ear off. At some point, I positioned one of the couch pillows behind my head and started to drift off to sleep. Going in and out of consciousness, I woke up for a moment completely and looked around the room. Shit was spinning at this point, and there was less people walking around. Way less. I pulled my phone out and checked the time. It was 3:45 a.m. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and leaned my head back on the pillow. I started closing my eyes, but right before I did, I noticed that the blank face guy was now leading the ghost face girl up the stairs. Her head was down, and she looked like she was barely awake and drunk as hell. He was helping her walk up the steps, and then they disappeared into a bedroom. The next thing I knew, Brad was shaking me and telling me that he wanted to leave. I asked if he was cool to drive, and he assured me he was. I got to my feet, and the room spun. I felt like I was going to puke right there, but I managed to make it outside. The sun had just gone up when we made it back to Brad's house, and we both collapsed on his couches and passed out. Hours later, I awoke to Brad's sister waking him up and questioning him. She asked if we had gone to that party out in the country, and he said yes. She was frantic and said that somebody was killed there last night. I was now completely awake upon hearing this and so was Brad. I sat there silent, and Brad was asking who it was, what had happened. His sister said that she didn't know the girl's name yet, but that she was found murdered in an upstairs bedroom. She had been stabbed. I thought to myself, no way. Sure enough, to my disbelief, later on that day, they showed the girl that was killed, and it was the Ghostface girl. She was stabbed 36 times. The police questioned everybody who was at the party on Halloween, including Brad and I. Of course, I was very quick to tell them about the guy that brought her upstairs, and that he was wearing blue jeans, a black t-shirt, and a black blank face mask. To my knowledge, they never found that guy, and the person who threw the party said she never invited or saw the guy wearing a black blank face mask.
In the last decade and a half, it's become infinitely easier to obtain exactly what you're looking for by way of a couple keystrokes. The internet has made it all too simple to use a computer to change reality. An abundance of information is merely a search engine away, to the point where it's hard to imagine life is any different. Yet, a generation ago, when the words streaming and torrent were meaningless, save for conversations about water, people met face to face to conduct software swap parties, trading games and applications on Sharpie-labeled 5 1/4-inch floppy disks. Of course, most of the time the meets were a way for frugal, community-minded individuals to trade popular games like King's Quest and Maniac Mansion among themselves. However, a few early programming talents designed their own computer games to share amongst their circle of acquaintances, who in return would pass it on, until, if fun and well-designed enough, an independently developed game had its place in the collection of aficionados across the country. Think of it as the 80s equivalent of a viral video. Pale Luna, on the other hand, is never circulated outside the San Francisco Bay Area. All known copies have been long disposed of. All computers that have ever run the game now detritus buried under layers of filth and polystyrene. This fact is attributed to a number of rather abstruse design choices made by its programmer. Pale Luna was a text adventure in the vein of Zork and the Lurking Horror, at a time when said genre was swiftly going out of fashion. Upon booting the program, the player was presented with a screen almost completely blank, except for the text. You're in a dark room. Moonlight shines through the window. There is gold in the corner, along with a shovel and rope. There is a door to the east. Command? So began the game that one writer, for a long out-of-print fanzine declared as enigmatic, nonsensical, and completely unplayable, as the only commands that the game would accept were pick up gold, pick up shovel, pick up rope, open door, and go east. The player was soon presented with the following: reap your reward. Pale Luna smiles at you. You're in a forest. There are paths to the north, west, and east. Command? What quickly infuriated the few who've played the game was the confusing and buggy nature of the second screen onward. Only one of the directional decisions would be the correct one. For example, on this occasion, a command to go into the direction other than north would lead to the system freezing, requiring the operator to hard reboot the entire computer. Further, any subsequent screens, seemed to merely repeat the above text, with the difference being only the directions available. Worse still, the standard text adventure commands appeared to be useless. The only accepted non-movement related prompts were use gold, which caused the game to display the message. Not here. Use shovel, which brought up not now. And use rope, which prompted the text, you've already used this. Most who played the game progressed a couple of screens into it before becoming fed up by having to constantly reboot and tossing the disc in disgust, writing off the experience as a shoddily programmed farce. However, there's one thing about the world of computers that remains true. No matter the era, some people who use them have way too much time on their hands. A young man by the name of Michael Nevins decided to see if there was more to Pale Luna than what met the eye. 5 hours and 33 screens worth of trial and error and unplugged computer cords later, he finally managed to make the game display a different text. The text in the new area read, Pale Luna smiles wide. There are no paths. Pale Luna smiles wide. The ground is soft. Pale Luna smiles wide. Here. Command? It was another hour still before Nevin stumbled upon the proper combination of phrases to make the game progress any further. Dig hole. Drop gold. Then fill hole. This caused the screen to display, Congratulations. 40.24.24.8 Negative 121.4434. Upon which the game ceased to accept commands, requiring the user to reboot one last time. After some deliberation, Nevins came to the conclusion that the numbers referred to the lines of latitude and longitude. The coordinates led to a point in the sprawling forest that dominated the nearby Lassen Volcanic Park. As he possessed much more free time than sense, Nevins vowed to see Pale Luna through to its ending. The next day, armed with a map, a compass, and a shovel, he navigated the park's trails, noting with amusement how each turn he made corresponded roughly to those that he took in the game. Though he initially regretted bringing the cumbersome digging tool on a mere hunch, the path's similarity but all confirmed his suspicions that the journey would end with him face to face with an eccentric's buried treasure. Out of breath after a tricky struggle to the coordinates, he was pleasantly surprised by a literal stumble upon a patch of uneven dirt. Shoveling as excitedly as he was, it would be an understatement to say that he was taken aback when his heavy strokes unearthed the badly decomposing head of a blonde-haired little girl. Nevins promptly reported the situation to the authorities. The girl was identified as Kara Paulson, 11, reported as missing to the San Diego Police Department a year and a half prior. Efforts were made to track down the programmer of Pale Luna, but the nearly anonymous, legal gray area in which the software swapping community operated inexplicably led to many dead ends. Collectors have been known to offer upwards of 6 figures for an authentic copy of the game. The rest of Karen's body was never found.
It happened in my bedroom at the age of 10. I always had trouble sleeping, and I spent most nights tossing and turning. I was a horror film fanatic as a child, and being scared was something I didn't have much experience with. I was not afraid of the dark, nor was I easily swayed by strange sounds or odd encounters. I did, however, know when to haul ass out of a situation, or to find a trusted adult. I always slept with my closet door open, which will come to be of some significance later in the story. I should also mention that my family home was in a heavily wooded area, in what some may refer to as the middle of nowhere. One night, around 1 a.m., I awoke to a sound coming from underneath my bed. It sounded like one of my cats was scratching themselves with one of their feet, or doing something to cause a thumping beneath me. I had heard this same sound many times before, and its source had always been one of my fuzzy friends, so this time I didn't look. I closed my eyes and tried to resume my slumber. I turned over onto my left side, which left me facing the wall against which my bed was pressed up. I heard the sound again, and thinking that my cat was directly beneath me, I said good night. I was able to fall asleep once again. The next time I awoke, it was a surreal and shocking scene. The sheet and comforter of my bed were no longer covering me. I saw a man standing over my bed, poking me, fucking poking me with his finger. And the way in which he did so was truly horrifying. It was not the way that a child would poke a friend in jest. It was as if he was touching another human being for the first time, exploring the sensation of the tip of his index finger, jabbing at my flesh. What I saw was so unbelievable, so impossibly strange that I believed that I was dreaming. I tried desperately to awake from a nightmare, to no avail. The poking continued. He poked at my chest, at my belly, my legs and arms. Paralyzed and scared shitless, I yelled, "Wake up!" And with this, the man threw himself to the floor and closed his eyes, as if he was trying to lead me to believe that he was asleep or dead. I had no fucking idea. It was at this time that I realized I could not have been dreaming. I somehow found the ability to move, and I jumped from the top of my bed over to the man lying on the floor next to me, and ran towards my parents' room. When I got to their bedroom door, something came over me. I told myself that it was all impossible, that there was no way that a person could have entered our home without breaking in, as we have always kept every door and window locked at night. I had seen many strange things in my home, whilst either falling asleep or waking up. By the third or fourth time, after speaking to my mom and dad about it, I knew that it was my mind playing tricks on me. I turned away from my parents' bedroom door and decided to hastily check the house for a break-in. What I found was that there was nothing out of the ordinary. No broken windows or locks, no busted doors. Nothing. I assured myself that I had been dreaming or hallucinating, and blamed my obsession with horror for this. I made my way down the long, dark, and narrow hallway to my bedroom. I peeked inside and saw no one. I turned on the light, got down on the floor just outside the doorway, and looked underneath the bed. Nothing. I proceeded to check both of my windows for signs of a break-in, which were not present. Both windows were closed and locked. I knew it. I was totally seeing things. I crawled back into my bedroom and decided to watch some TV in order to calm myself down and distract myself from the thoughts of the scary as hell dream or hallucination I just had. I turned on the TV, flipped to a channel with a seemingly boring program, and put the remote close on my bedside table. I was lying on my right side, facing away from the wall that I mentioned previously. As I laid there, my eyes began to adjust to the dark room with the faint light from the TV screen. Just beyond the TV, I saw something that made my heart sink into the pit of my stomach. Inside my closet was one of the doors, now slightly closed. I saw the man standing perfectly still, facing the wall, hiding, waiting for me to fall asleep, I imagine. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I sat and stared at the man in my closet for what seemed like minutes, but for likely only a few seconds. I quietly got out of bed, hoping that the man wouldn't notice and that my dad could catch him hiding in the closet. I once again made my way to my parents' bedroom door, still remaining as quiet as I possibly could, and went inside. I shook my dad and my mom at the same time, and when they awoke, I said, "Shh, don't make any sound. There's someone in my closet." My parents both jumped up and said, "What?" I repeated myself and asked them to please call 911. Neither of my parents doubted my claim, as I had always been honest and forthright. They both knew there was no way I was making this up or that I was mistaken. I'm sure that the look I must have had on my face made it clear that it was really happening. My dad told my mom and I that he was going to look and urged us to stay in their bedroom and lock the door. So we did. At this point, I was beyond scared. I didn't know what the man was capable of, whether he had a weapon or whether my dad was safe. I just stood in the room with my mom and cried. After what felt like hours, my dad knocked on the door and told me it was him and that it was okay to open the door. My mom unlocked the door and let my dad inside. I said something to the effect of, "Did you get him?" And my dad looked at me with the most unsettling and confused look imaginable. He said, "There's no one there." I assured him that there was indeed a man in my room and that he had poked me. My dad said he had just checked every inch of the house and found no one. He had also checked the doors and windows, just as I had. Then it hit me. He must have a key. As soon as I said that, my parents looked at each other in absolute terror. Our nearest neighbor, a trusted and beloved friend whom we considered family, was in possession of a key to our house, as she had regularly babysat me since I was a toddler. She was the only person outside of my immediate family with a key to our home. Soon after this revelation, the police arrived. They took statements, they checked around our property, and they left. None of us got any sleep that night. The next day, my dad went to my neighbor's house and asked if she knew where her key to our house was. She said yes, and when she went to show him, she saw that it was missing. Her home had no signs of a break-in, and she had always kept her doors and windows locked. My parents had all of the locks on our doors changed, and opted to never again give a key to anyone, except in the wake of an emergency. I never discovered the identity of the man that lurked in my bedroom that night. The event left me traumatized, and it took me a very long time to accept what happened and move on. My sleeping trouble turned into full-on insomnia, and for about a decade, I was unable to sleep without a light on. It had been 20 years since that night, and apart from my parents, I'd never told a soul about it until now.
It was a dark and stormy night. Steve had just come in from having tied down anything that could possibly blow away in the wind outside. Cold seeping into his bones, he decided to go sit by the fireplace to warm up. He closed the door to the large living room of the large house he had just purchased. His wife and daughter were back at the old home, gathering up some of the last items to be moved into their new home. Steve decided to stay the night by himself to get a feel for the house. The house was probably too large for such a small family, but Steve couldn't pass up the good buy he got on it. An old antique house, incredibly large, in a quiet, secluded area, for such a small price. Steve still couldn't believe how lucky he was. The television was one of the items his wife was bringing the next day, so he decided to read a book to pass the time. He sipped at his hot coffee while being warmed by the crackling fireplace. Steve couldn't help but look forward to many more nights like this, all snug in front of the grand fireplace on the cold winter nights that would eventually come. He had just started to get into his book when he heard a tapping sound from the upper floor. Steve brushed it off quickly. Old houses like this always make sounds like that in movies, even though I'm sure it's had enough time to settle. He had to chuckle over his corny joke. He went back to his book, but the sound started again. It seemed to be moving across the room upstairs. Perhaps mice, thought Steve. I should really look into that tomorrow morning. The wife would not be pleased to find mice in her new home. Tomorrow, though, no use chasing mice in the dark. Then Steve heard what sounded like a door opening upstairs. The big room was starting to feel a bit less cozy. He tried to pass it off as his imagination running wild, and tried to immerse himself in his book. It did no good, because this time the sounds didn't go away. The tapping and footsteps started to sound like they were coming down the stairs that led to the living room door. Thump, 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 louder and louder as it went down. Steve had to put the book down now, and was staring at the door with great intensity. What if it's a robber? He thought, or worse. No, he mustn't let his imagination go wild. He stared at the great door and heard the footsteps keep thumping, finally coming up the stairs and toward the door. Thump, thump, thump. He stared at the door, his fear increasing. Thump, thump, thump. The fireplace suddenly went out. The door handle started to turn. Steve was too frightened to get up to stop it, stuck in his place by fear. Slowly it creaked open, until it was finally completely open to Steve. A great blinding light filled the room from the door. A blood-curdling scream arose from Steve. Ah! Linda pulled into the driveway in her truck. She was sure she finally had gotten every last thing and was ready to move into the new house. Her daughter bounced out of the car and ran towards her new home. Linda thought, not for the first time, that the house was much too big for the three of them, but Steve was too in love with it for her to change his mind. She had told Steve not to spend the night in the house alone, but he had insisted. She smiled to herself. The big goof was probably going to tell their daughter all kinds of ghost stories he had made up last night, and she'll end up trying to soothe her to bed tonight. Her daughter bounded into the house. She followed closely behind. She called for Steve, but no answer. Probably still asleep in that huge living room, or can't hear through the door. He loved that huge room most about this house. She told her daughter to check the living room for her father, and she went off to do that, while Linda started unpacking some of the food they had brought in the kitchen, when she heard the scream of her daughter. She ran to the living room to see what was the matter. She looked in, and screamed herself. Steve was sitting in his chair, book on the floor. His hair had turned stark white. His clothes were ripped, and it looked like he had tried to claw his eyes out with all the claw marks on his face. He was dead, with a look of stark terror etched forever on his face. Linda retched and cried, "What could possibly have done this to her husband? What?" Then, through her sobs and her daughter's screaming, she thought she heard a thumping sound upstairs.
I need to give a little bit of background first, because it does play a role in this story. Growing up, I was the kid who was considered the crazy troublemaker, as I would sneak out at night and go to the abandoned buildings that had a lot of ghost stories around them. At some of these places, I never experienced more than just sounds and some little forms of appearing and disappearing things. I mean, I was a kid, and I was looking for things like that. It's not like I was going into these creepy old buildings expecting to see an axe murderer pop out. Just something small, something paranormal. Having been around these buildings a lot over my childhood, I got pretty used to seeing weird things. I remember seeing my first ghost when I was about 4 years old, though my memory is slightly fuzzy, I guess because I was so young. My grandfather, who had passed, came to visit me and my younger brother in the middle of the night. I screamed when he left the room. My mother came jogging in as my scream woke them up, and even my mother admits to hearing her dead father's voice say, "Good night, dear," through the baby monitors. As she got to my room, there were bloody footprints leading from the center of the hallway to my bedroom, and they stopped at the end of my crib. And this next story starts on a regular Halloween night. I was 15 at the time this happened, so I was feeling too old to trick or treat with the other kids. But my younger siblings needed someone to take them, seeing as they were still pretty young. At the time, my father was at work, and he's a trucker, so he was gone for several weeks at a time, and my mother was too busy studying for school. So I ended up taking them, walking them around house to house. I even ran into a few of my friends that were also walking their siblings. We let them go up to the house in the group as we stopped a bit and talked. We made arrangements to meet up after we were done walking our siblings around to trick-or-treat. 20 minutes later, all the young kids were done with their trick-or-treating, so we all went home and met up at an old bridge, trying to figure out what we can do to entertain ourselves for the rest of the Halloween night. Now, they mentioned this ghost story about this white house in the swamps that wasn't actually too far from us, but I remembered that was one house I was always told to stay away from, as my mother visited it, having the same interest in exploring abandoned places as I did. She has had her own bad experiences there, but that is a story for another time. I was told the story about it all over again by my friend. The house was built back in the day when there were still slaves. A man caught his wife cheating on him with a slave and was pregnant with his child. They were planning on running away together, to leave her husband and her other kids behind. Later that night, the man killed his whole family and tortured the slave. That night, he tied the slave up in the slave house and gutted his wife first and then placed a noose around both of their throats, throwing her and her baby over the bell tower, hanging them in that manner. Then he went after his children, killing one in the forest around their house, chopping him up with an axe. He drowned his daughter in the pool in their backyard, then went back to the slave house, showing him what he did to his slave's lover and his child, and then commenced torturing the man to death. Once he finally died from blood loss, the father killed himself in the main room in front of the front door. They were all found a week later as the father had not gone to work in a while, and it was his employee's payday. But as the accountant walked up to the building, seeing his wife's and baby's slowly decaying bodies, buzzards picking at their corpses, the accountant walked up gagging at the sight of them, holding his shirt to his nose, smelling his sweat. But that was much better than the smell around him. He managed to climb the stairs and take long strides to the front door. The smell was stronger than before. He clutched his nose even tighter, so much so that his knuckles turned white. He banged on the door, hard, mentally begging someone to answer so he could escape this horrid smell. He banged 3 times, pulling his hand up for the 4th time. He hit it once, and it opened to reveal a swarm of flies around the father's body. He looked up, and as a flood of the smell of rotting flesh slammed into him, he vomited and ran away, going towards town, wanting to get away from this horror. That is where the story ended. But I knew better. I knew that the story did not end there. No, it continues into more blood and gore than what she had told them, and for their sakes I did not correct her. Still though, the blood drained from their faces and they turned pale just from that story. So I didn't want to sicken them any further from the rest of the story. But for you listening, I'll make an exception, because from what I've heard, the man did not kill himself. The townspeople somehow found out about what he had done. Someone had found him bathing in the blood of those he had killed, so they tied him to a pole and burned him at it, just like a witch. No one knew how a man like that, who was so wealthy and famous around town, could have murdered his whole family and his slaves, let alone bathe in their viscera. I seem to have gotten a bit sidetracked, so I'll go back to us on that Halloween night. My friend that was telling the story was visibly shaking. She seemed excited and scared at the time. I could not tell, but she then asked them if they had the guts to follow her into the building. We all stood standing on the old bridge, waiting. They eventually all said no in shaky voices that seemed to match in each other's fears, and I stayed silent. Then she laughed and called them all chickens for not having the guts to go into that house. Then she boasted that she was not scared and would go in without them no problems. As soon as she stated that, she instantly regretted it, because she knew that they would jump on her statement and dare her to do it. And they did. But there was one rule that none of them wanted to follow, and they also didn't want to break it. That rule was that someone else had to go up there with her and by her side the whole time to make sure she did not go back on her dare. It only took a few minutes before they decided I would go, even though I was about to volunteer, because I knew what could happen at this house. Or at least I thought I did. The two of us headed toward the house, the rest of the group waiting at a safe distance away, but still able to see what was going on. We found the house and we climbed the stairs. My friend was holding my arm the whole time. I could tell she was really scared, but was still going through with it. In my guts, something was screaming, "Don't go in that house," and we passed several warning signs and no trespassing signs on the way. The house on the outside was all boarded up, only a few windows had slight cracks showing even the door was boarded up, but not enough to keep two curious teens out. We pushed the door open, slipping inside. It was dark, barely any light seeping through the windows and doors. It smelled really musty and a bit like mildew, which is normal in most abandoned places. We turned on our flashlights, remembering that we had brought them with use for this very moment. We walked up the stairs, looking around, analyzing the whole house, looking for something and hoping that we didn't find anything terrifying. We walked around, waiting for something to happen, but not sure exactly what. It was getting closer to 12 at midnight. The dare was only to stay in the house until 12:30. That is when the worst is supposed to happen. So we climbed down the stairs after exploring the whole house, not seeing anything interesting. My friend seemed satisfied, as we had not seen anything spooky during the whole exploration. I think she was feeling a bit better. I have to admit, I was also getting ready to get out of that house. It was almost time, and I was excited to be out of the place. When we got down the stairs, I remember it being 11:45. We picked a spot in the light and sat down on the floor. We planned to wait the rest of the time out. She laid her head on my shoulder, getting a bit tired. I was so anxious. The time seemed to pass slower at that point. At 11:59, I stared at the ceiling. Something suddenly felt wrong. I woke up my friend because I felt the temperature drop around me. We stood up straight as the air started to feel thick. My friend grabbed my arm again and held it tight, to the point I could feel her cutting off my circulation. Now, get this, the house began to shake. Literally shake, as if we were caught in an earthquake. After a minute, it stopped. We were terrified right away, to be honest. And the air only got colder. We huddled together to keep ourselves from shaking. We both glanced back and forth around us, afraid that something was coming. And it was. We started hearing voices, dozens upon dozens of voices. Men, women, children, all around us. They didn't sound angry or sad or anything like that. They actually sounded happy, as if we were in the middle of a lively party. But slowly those voices died down. But one singular voice grew louder. This voice was deep, old, and full of hatred. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it grew louder and louder until, "Out! Out! Out!" This gravelly voice yelled at us. We shot up and ran for the door as fast as we could. I ran too fast. I ended up tripping over a board, falling hard and weird on my leg. But I quickly picked myself back up and ran as fast as I could, limping all the way. My other friends seemed scared when they saw me limping, and she was crying. They helped me get to the hospital. It was a long and agonizing walk, but I didn't want to go confront my mom after this. The doctor asked what had happened. He didn't believe what any of my friends had said, and I did not say a word to them about it. They could only speculate what ghosts we might have seen and stuff like that. They took care of my leg, taking an x-ray and setting me up with a cast and crutches. My mom was called and soon arrived. She took care of the bill and was very irritated and mad the whole way home. She was upset that we had been out so late in a dangerous place and said that I could have died, that I was lucky that my leg was the only thing I broke. It's been about 7 years since then. My knee causes me trouble from time to time, aches coming from nowhere, but I push through it. But every time I feel a tinge of pain in that leg, I am reminded of the foolish Halloween night that changed my beliefs entirely. Hearing those voices, it was all too real, and I wasn't alone in that experience. Now I know that something more awaits us after this life, even if some of us are a bit angry when we pass.
This is written from the perspective of my mother. This house was so pretty. No more than 10 years old in 1965 when I was 17 and we began renting it. It was over a mile from the main road of the tiny town, a village really, with a yard that backed up against the woods. It was by far the nicest place that my dirt poor family had ever lived in. We had been there less than a year when I was doing laundry in the basement. As I turned, a painting I had never noticed before caught my eye. The morbid, straight-faced mouth of a little boy let me know the painting was old. But it was the eyes that chased me up the stairs. Like so many paintings, its eyes appeared to follow you wherever you went. Unlike other paintings, the sense of presence, even of menace, let me know right away that our time in that house would not be peaceful. The real trouble started in such a little way that it could be interpreted 1,000 ways. The clothes would not stay on the line. You could hang laundry in the calmest, clearest day of spring, and within hours it would be scattered all over the yard. You saw the results with your own eyes. You knew the weather could not be responsible, and yet your rational mind simply took it as a mildly strange phenomenon that meant nothing. With a little more foresight, we might have listened to my grandmother's admonitions that laundry won't stay on the line in a haunted house, and simply moved out then. But of course, we would always have wondered if we had simply overreacted. I can't remember the first time the sound on the stairs was heard, or who heard it. What I do remember is that day or night, the sound seemed to simply materialize whenever it wanted to. The staircase from the basement was made up of 2 stairs, a square landing, and then more stairs up to the kitchen. In the kitchen was a heavy woodlock with a door and a deadbolt. The occurrence, the apparition, whatever you choose to call it, was exactly the same every time. It began with heavy footfalls on the stairs. There was a brief pause as the stair climber reached the landing. Then its journey up the stairs continued. As it neared the top stair, it seemed to lose its footing and crash down the stairs in a thunderous racket. You could hear the heavy body of that which was not there hit and finally stop moving. Just then, the kitchen door would fly all the way open and the apparition would end. We took to keeping the door locked all the time, both with the key and the deadbolt. It was a futile gesture. Still the force would climb the stairs. Still the tumult of it falling back down the stairs. And finally the doubly locked door opened as if it hadn't been shut at all, and a wind had blown it open. Early on, my 5 feet tall, rail-thin but fearless aunt resolved to show us how silly we were all being. We all confirmed that the door was locked and deadbolted. My father and uncle left for the evening, leaving the women and children behind. In only a short space of time, the first footfall landed with a thud on the first stair. Knowing what was coming, my brother, mother, sisters, and I were already terrified. My aunt remained unflappable. "I'm not scared. I'll see what it is," she declared. She walked the small space from the living room to the kitchen as we approached hysterics. My aunt rounded the corner and saw the door, unmistakably locked twice, standing wide open. With a shrill scream, she ran from the room as my siblings and I climbed furniture and each other to get as far away from the kitchen as we could. That was enough, or should have been. How different things could have been if we had just let that be enough and left. But we didn't. And the events were neither at their end nor at their climax, and my little brother would pay for our stubbornness for the rest of his life. His habit was to walk into town and do the things teenagers do. He would stay out late, and to avoid waking the rest of us, he would sleep in the basement regardless of its history. One night he followed his customary pattern. He went to sleep in the basement. My baby brother was fearless. Late in the night, something he couldn't describe happened. All he could say, when he would talk about it at all, was that something woke him up though nothing appeared out of place. Uneasy, but undeterred, he went back to sleep. When he was awakened the second time, he was engulfed in a blue mist. He tried to move, but couldn't. He tried to scream, but couldn't. The mist was cold, but not wet. It was alive. My brother could feel the mist trying to get inside of him. He could not know what it would mean if it got inside him. He only knew it'd be the worst, maybe the last thing that ever happened to him. So he stayed awake. He fought to move. He fought to scream. He fought to keep the mist outside of him. He may have been fighting for his soul. Time means nothing in such circumstances, and whether it was 5 minutes or hours, he doesn't know. My brother was different from then on. He was nervous and frightened, and he simply couldn't sleep. His only rest came when exhaustion overcame him and he essentially passed out. At night he was never in the dark. At least one light had to be on. Half a century later, he still relives that night from time to time, staying up with all the lights on. One more set of renters moved in, then rapidly moved out. They too found more than just a house in the sweet-looking little rental. But the final occupant, however briefly, was the owner. After the last renters moved out, He moved into the house alone and died of what was ruled a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Like so many other things about the house, nobody will ever really know what happened. The house still stands, abandoned and in shambles, but has not had a resident in 55 years.
First off, this is my first post. I apologize for any spelling and grammatical errors. Second, understand that at the time this occurred, I was not living the healthiest of lifestyles. I quit using heroin when I was 25 and moved to France for 5 years. I just recently moved back to the States this past summer. This is relevant because it speaks to my mindset at the time all of this occurred, and why I was comfortable taking the absurd risks that I took. I was a drug fiend. Anyway, on to the story. When I was 20, I had moved from Baltimore to the Eastern Shore, thinking the distance would help mitigate my habit. It didn't. Instead, I just ended up driving to Baltimore every couple of days and buying several $100s worth of heroin instead of just buying less on a daily basis. In the process, I got to know a lot of odd people. Some of them hacks. In Baltimore, a hack is someone who operates as a cabbie illegally. Often, they take people into the city to pick up their drugs, or just charge half the rate of a legit cab driver. I had met an older guy at a Dunkin' Donuts in Dundalk who did this. Now, I wasn't in the habit of using hacks, but one night, my ride went down on a one-way street, the wrong way, in front of a police officer, and we were pulled over and searched. It ended up the idiot had brought his stash of pot with him, so we were arrested and sent to BCDC. God, I was pissed. Around midnight that night, they released me. It ends up that not only had my friend admitted ownership of the marijuana, but the reason they'd used to search us, that his license was showing up as suspended, was bullshit. And my friend's lawyer had called them on it. So there I was, in the middle of Baltimore City, with no ride, nowhere to go, dope sick, in the middle of December. They released some men and women separately, and my friend's cell phone was still off at the time when I tried to call it. It ends up he had been released several hours earlier, but had left his phone in the truck. For anyone that hasn't had the pleasure of being arrested, they impound your vehicle. So, if you're lucky enough to get processed and released after 5 p.m. or before 8 a.m., you're out of luck getting your vehicle back. Not to mention, another couple $100s in the hole. As I mentally ran through my list of options, I remembered the hack I'd met earlier that week, and decided to give him a try. I figured that at the least, if he was still awake, I could pay him to help me cop, and drop me off at the Greyhound bus station to wait out the night. Well, I called, and not only was he up and about, but he was also only about a 10-minute drive away from where I was being released. The fact that he was still up and about at 1 in the morning may have given normal people pause. I just assumed he was probably a crackhead, tweaker, or some such, and wrote it off as luck. Within a half an hour, he showed up, and I clambered into the long, gray sedan, just grateful to be out of the cold and back on solid ground. Now, to give you an idea of the way this guy came off, the best way I can think to describe him is gray. Everything about him was just gray. His vehicle was a medium, dinged up gray. His hair was longish and a deep, solid gray. Even his pallor seemed gray. I remember he had the face of a postmenopausal woman. Sort of drolly, if you know what I mean. Soft. In retrospect, the guy was creepy as all get out, but at the time, he just seemed unexceptional. And really, in the drug world, there are so many weird people that you're forced to deal with on a daily basis, that unless someone comes off as blatantly volatile, you eventually learn to just ignore the crazy. If you don't, you'll drown in it. We managed to cop in Baltimore. There's always someone out. I asked the guy to take me to the Greyhound station, just wanting to get well and to curl up till I could think about catching a bus. And he just sort of looked at me, looked down, and looked back up, and then asked if I wanted to go watch TV at his place till the buses began running. Looking back, I remember feeling a bit hesitant, but the man seemed so unexceptional, such a non-entity, that I couldn't imagine him being a threat. And if I'm entirely honest, I just wanted a clean, warm place to get it on. I was well beyond dope sick at this point, and my all-consuming thought was just to get straight Taking my silence for hesitation, I remember him telling me not to worry, that he wasn't going to try anything. I ought maybe to have mentioned that I'm a 5'6", 100-pound female, 20 years old at the time, and that the bus station wasn't the safest place for a tiny female like myself to be hanging out at 2 o'clock in the morning, that he was just trying to help. Well, F me. But I thanked him, said sure, and we proceeded to drive out towards the county. To this day, I'm still not sure what direction we'd even gone in. Just that wherever it was, he lived. It was about half an hour outside of the city, and that it was not in the woods, but in a heavily wooded area. As we neared his house, he started acting a bit strange. Not enough to set off the alarm bells yet, but still. I'll never forget him saying that either the police chief of that county, or the chief's son, lived in the same cul-de-sac that he did. That they were friends, and that the guy had helped him out of what he termed a few predicaments. The house was right on a lake, with a dock in the backyard. I have no idea what county this was in, and no one I've tried describing it to has ever been able to pinpoint it either. It was totally alien to me. We pulled into his driveway, and I was shocked to see that his house was closer to being a mansion than the hovel I was assumed I was in for. He would go on to tell me, as he parked and we walked up to the door, that it had belonged to his mother, who had recently passed away. Here's this ratty little man, with a ratty little car, and his ratty little clothes, and he's living in this extremely, well, not nice, but expensive house, driving around all day and night for pocket change, and basically living at Dunkin' Donuts. I was more than a bit skeptical. When we went inside, the situation became even stranger, but at least more familiar, more in line with what I've seen of the guy so far. The house was covered in two things, dust and knickknacks. And when I say covered, I mean covered. Every square inch of surface space was covered in tacky little porcelain angels and dollar store crap, shelves, tables, the top of the ginormous old box television. Even the kitchen was covered in them. The kitchen itself I only saw for a brief moment, but I'll never forget how even the sink was filled with the things. There were the obligatory dollies that all old people seem to have in spades, all of them coated in dust and discolored. I asked where the bathroom was, and excused myself to go get high. I was getting pretty weirded out by this point, and just wanted to get straight, so I could decide what to do. I did my thing, and went back to the living room, which was the first room you walked into whenever you came in the door. I didn't want to go any deeper into the house. I wanted to take a look at the lock on the door, create an exit strategy, and hope I didn't really need one. That hope was quickly dashed. The first thing the guy did was bring me a glass of water and a handful of pills. Puzzled, I asked him what the pills were for. He said, to sleep. Now, it's 3 a.m. at this point, and I have to be at the bus station by 6. At most, we have maybe 2 hours before we will have to leave. I tell him I don't think that's a great idea, since falling asleep isn't on the agenda, that we don't have time for a quick nap. Well, he starts to become pretty insistent that I take the pills. Believe me, if we weren't so out in the middle of nowhere, not to mention it being December, and bitter cold, at this point, I'd have booked. Instead, I sort of laughed and took 2 of the pills out of his hand, stuck them in my mouth, and took a sip of the water, saying, well, what the hell? Immediately he brightened and shuffled off to get another glass of water, which I'd requested. Looking back, I shouldn't have even drank the bloody water. Idiot. I spit out the pills and shoved them in the seat of the sofa. This whole time we'd been talking about little things. Baltimore, local politics, music, nothing deep. At this point, he starts asking me about chemicals, about drugs. Specifically, what sort of drugs would knock someone out, but not harm them. How much you would need of what for someone, say, tiny like myself. I try to act as if this is entirely normal conversation fodder. At this point, it seemed to me that my existence depended on my not registering how abnormal the entire situation was. I think my thought process at the time, and especially as time went on, you'll see what I mean shortly, was that I couldn't act as if I knew what was going on. That I couldn't act as if there was something strange or alarming occurring, that he would be stupid and let me live if he knew that I knew exactly what was going on, that I need to see him as a non-threat. The whole time we were having this discussion, by the way, the guy kept trying to get behind me. At one point, he succeeded and started rubbing my shoulders. I just laughed, said I wasn't a fan of massages, and that I needed to run to the bathroom. When I came back, I made sure to sit on the sofa that was up against the wall, and I'm looking around for a phone. But I don't want to ask for one, because I don't want him to know that my cell phone is dead. Yeah, another great stroke of luck. My cell phone had died about 5 minutes after I called the creep to come pick me up. Now, this whole time, the guy has been pacing around the living room, sitting for a few minutes, only to get back up again, walk back and forth a bit, and then sit back down. He began talking about his mother, how she collected these knickknacks, how she died, and how he'd been thinking about renovating the house, but hadn't had the heart to make any changes to anything yet. So he says he wants to show me something. He wants to show me the upstairs. Why I didn't run screaming out of the place, I don't know. I think part of me was still very much hoping that I was misreading the situation. That the guy was just lonely, and creepy, and socially maladaptive. Not actually dangerous or anything. But here, we have yet one more horror film trope coming into play. Creepy obsession with mother, and bizarre, dust-filled house, perfectly preserved in memory of mom, down to the last glass she used, still sitting on the kitchen table. I shit you not. And now, the guy wants to show me the upstairs. He wants to show me her room. So I follow him up the stairs. And at first, he makes it obvious he wants me to go up before him. But I wasn't having any of that. We get to the second story. There were 3. I never made it to the third, however. And turn off down this hallway, and he opens the first door on his left. Goes in. I'm half expecting to see the body of his dead mom, laying on the bed or something, and find myself seriously relieved. And I find myself standing in just one more dust-coated room, full of crap. I don't remember much about the room. I remember the bed was made, and then I couldn't tell if the comforter was dark, or just covered in so much dust that it appeared that way. He gestured for me to sit down. I obliged. What followed was the worst of the experience. He sat down on the end of the bed next to me, and began talking about his mother. After a bit, he looked at me and said, "You're so beautiful. You look like a little girl. I bet little girls really like you." And I tried to lead the conversation back to his mom. He gets up and walks over to the far wall of the bedroom. Starts referring to our earlier conversation about drugs and knocking someone out. He asked me what I would use to knock out a child. What I would use to keep a child knocked out for long periods of time. Safely, of course. I'm trying, at this point, to act as if I'm still on point. As if I'm not finding this line of conversation to be dreadful, creepy, and horrible. I tell him I really don't know. I'm just a dope fiend. Not a chemist. He asked about heroin, and if that would be safe. At this point, I've just had it, and I think he can tell. He says, "I want to show you something." I begin to protest, to tell him that I have to use the restroom, but he insists. He pushes on the cheap wood paneling on the wall, and a large square of it swings open. He gestures inside, says he's been working on it for a few years, that it's just big enough for a small woman, but made for a child. It's a sort of cot, and there are loops on the ends, for rope, or some other restraint, I'm sure. I noped out of the bedroom, down the stairs. I didn't run. I just told him I had to go to the restroom again. While I am walking, shaking down the stairs, I pull my cell phone out of my purse and mimic dialing on it. I was lucky that he stayed behind too close up the bedroom and that thing in the wall, so he didn't see that my phone wasn't even turning on. I pretended to be having a conversation with a friend of mine, and at the point that he showed up, began loudly recounting what had transpired that evening to my friend. I told him how I'd called that night gent we had met. I had been with my friend Tom at the time we'd met this guy at Dunkin' Donuts to pick me up, and then I was at the guy's house, but would be leaving shortly. I then pretended that my friend had offered to come pick me up from the bus stop, and in one respect, I was lucky. The guy knew I was living out of town. but he didn't know I was living 4 hours away, or that any friend of mine would have to make that hellishly long trip if they were going to come pick me up. I told my friend that I'd head out to the bus stop ASAP, and that I'd see him soon. I still remember the look on the guy's face as I said that. It darkened. You know, the look that snotty, spoiled little kids will get when someone actually dares to tell them no. It was that look, but worse. Because there was something almost perverse about seeing it so openly displayed on the face of a 50-something-year-old man. So I started to grab my purse and zip up my coat, all the while gibbering on about how my friend remembered him and had said to tell him hi. It seemed, at the time, that there were two things that were of the utmost importance at the time. The first, to make him feel that I hadn't found him, or anything he'd said or displayed odd. I didn't want him to think that I'd be some sort of threat to his plans, or his well-being, if he let me leave. Secondly, I wanted him to know that he was identifiable, and that someone, at least, someone who could identify him, knew I was with him. This is pretty much the end of the story, although I had one more, far worse encounter with the same guy a couple of weeks after this incident. He took me to the bus station and acted shitty the entire time we were driving there. The second encounter convinced me that not only was I lucky to be alive, but I had spent several hours in the home of a serial killer. Do I think he had done anything yet at the time I spent the terrifying early morning at his home? No. I think he was gearing up to, though. And by the second, brief encounter I had with the guy, I'm positive he had. I don't know how to put it. That uncertainty he displayed with me was gone. I think by that point, he had crossed the line. In closing, I will say this. I did take down his license number as he was leaving that morning, and I did contact a friend of mine who was a police officer. A year or so after all of this happened, my friend called me and asked if I still had the guy's information. I didn't. He'd lost it, if he'd ever really bothered to write it down at all, and there had been several disappearances of young children in the very same areas that the guy, in our second, blissfully brief encounter, mentioned that he trolled. Just scoping out the little girls. I did try to find the man, and began by going to the Dunkin' Donuts that he had hung out at. The owner, who said the guy had spent every single morning there for a couple of years, told me that he had just quit coming the same week that this happened, and I think I finally figured out why he hung out there every morning. The day I went there looking for the guy, I noticed that there was a bus stop right in front of the Dunkin' Donuts. A bus stop full of elementary school kids.
This story takes place roughly in 2000, when I was 5 years old. My parents lived in this 75-year-old brick house. Before we moved in, they were told that in the mid-1950s, a man had been shot and killed on the back porch. My little brother was 3 years old, and his favourite little toy car had a clown on top of it, and it would light up. This toy car would say, "Na na 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 na, boo, boo," when you pulled it back and then let it go across the floor. We shared a bedroom, and my mother would put his toy out of his reach at night so we could sleep. My father has worked the overnight shift at his job for 20 years, so at the time, my mum would take care of us while he was at work. She retells this story as, one night, the toy clown car rolled off the shelf and landed on the floor next to my bed. It rolled out into the living room and would roll right up to my mum, keeping completely silent until it was right in front of her. Then it would light up and go, "Na na 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 na, boo, boo," once to let her know it was there. She picked it up and took it back to our room, also to make sure we weren't out of bed. A few weeks went by without incident. But one night, my mum was watching a late night rerun of I Love Lucy, and the toy clown car rolled out to her again. My mum just left the toy next to her, and it sat there with her and watched TV. This clown car would roll out to my mum every night after that to keep her company. Each night, the toy clown car would beep at her once to announce its presence. One day, she told my father about the toy, and he suggested they pull out the old Ouija board he'd been given by a stranger while he was stationed with the Navy in Japan. So they got out the proper precautionary tools to use the board, like white candles, and then burnt sage after use. According to my parents, they talked to a man who had died in the house many years before and had not found a way out. He was making himself known as a kind of energy because my mum had been uneasy in certain places in the home, like the porch and the basement. As unbelievable as it sounds, they talked to the man in the clown car both on the board and would ask the car yes or no questions, 2 beeps for yes, 1 beep for no. They had a couple conversations with this man, finding out that he was the man who had been shot on the porch. Before they said goodbye on their 4th session, he told them he needed help and to dig a few feet down in the backyard next to the fence. The next morning, my father took a shovel and dug. He hit something hard and pulled out what he told us were the femur and tibia bones of a cow. To this day, I'm not sure what he did with them, and he tells me I made that story up. A few days later, on a Wednesday night, my mum was alone again on the couch watching TV. My brother's toy clown did not move off the shelf without my mum's assistance after that. My brother complained that his toy was now broken. My mum figured the batteries just needed to be changed. She opened up the bottom of the toy, and there weren't any batteries inside it.
I was 3 the first time my mom got sick. I learned to cook so dinner would be on the table when Dad got home. I'm not sure how edible it was, but Dad would always smile and say it was delicious. I was 6 the second time she got sick. My baby sister was only a few months old, so I learned to make bottles and clean diapers. Taking care of Mika wasn't any harder than taking care of Mom. I was 11 when we moved to a small town way out in the middle of nowhere, and she got the sickest she had ever been. Dad was gone for work, so I learned to hide Mika in the closet, buried underneath a mountain of stuffed animals. Don't come out of the closet, Mika. Don't even make a noise, or the monster will get you. My parents had pulled me from public education and decided to homeschool me. I would never have admitted it then, but I was kind of excited at the prospect of doing schoolwork sprawled out on our living room floor in my pajamas. Everything went well for the first few months. Then Dad had to go to another state for a few weeks. The nearest neighbors were only a few acres away, and we were prepped on my mother's medical issues. Dad left, promising that nothing could go wrong. He'd be home as quick as he could, and then everything would be okay. As an 8-year-old veteran of taking care of my mother, I was confident in my abilities. He was wrong. I was wrong. We could never have been prepared for the long, long weeks ahead of us. To be honest, I don't remember what time of day it was, or even what I was doing when I suddenly felt that something was off. I do remember that it was in the middle of winter. There was 6 feet of snow that year, and it was in the double negatives. Mom had been feeling unwell, and had spent most of the day teaching Mika to read from the comfort of the couch. Then everything got quiet. "Mama?" Mika's little cherub face was filled with worry. Mama was just standing there, staring at nothing, her eyes glassy and vacant. The reading book fell from her lap as she slowly stood up and absently walked into the kitchen. We could hear her soft mumbling to herself in there. Then the laughter started. The horrible, awful, hysterical laughter. There was something wrong in it. It wasn't the ha-ha something is so funny. It was rough and maniacal. I ran into the kitchen and found my mother gripping the counter with tears streaming down her face, eyes full of fear, laughing uncontrollably. She started to hyperventilate, great sobs racking her body, while still laughing in that terrifying way. I rushed to the phone and called the neighbors. Mom was in bed for 3 days straight after that. Blinds pulled, no lights, door shut tight. I only went into her room to feed her, help her to the bathroom, and give her medication. Little red capsules, 3 for the first time, then 2 every 4 hours. Mika and I were very, very quiet during those 72 hours. On the 4th day, she finally emerged. She seemed wilted. Her deep blue eyes seemed darker than before, but that could have been due to the dark circles surrounding them. She smiled weakly at us and mumbled an apology for being a bad mom, and told us what good girls we were. She slowly shuffled around the house for the next few days, attempting to do laundry, but the noise hurt her head, cooking, but the smells made her nauseous, teaching us, but her brain felt fuzzy. I worried she had had another seizure. We weren't allowed to tell Dad when he got his weekly call. We weren't to stress him out. Her next episode started much the same. Everything went quiet. The hairs on the back of my neck stood at attention when I turned to look at Mom. She had a crazy smirk on her face this time. It was almost sneer-like. "Mom?" She waved her head dismissively at me. "Mom, I'm gonna go get your medicine." She cocked her head to the side like a puppy and giggled at me. "Sure, my medicine." She covered her mouth and giggled. I shot out of the living room and into her bedroom to get those red little pills. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew those pills were my lifeline. Mika had started to cry when I got back into the room. I handed Mom her pills and headed for the phone, except it wasn't there. I stared at the empty phone jack in the hall with confusion. "Sissy, she took the phone," Mika whimpered. As I turned to look at my mom, the laughter started. It was deeper than before. Fear shot through my body like lightning. I grabbed Mika and rushed her to the coat closet. Do you know what it's like to be 11 years old, forcing a sobbing 5-year-old into her snowsuit, to send her by herself to trek through the 6 feet of snow over 5 acres to get to the neighbors? To just know, to absolutely just know, that she'd be safer out in the negative 50-degree Alaskan winter than in the warm house with her mother. It's terrifying. I knew Mika felt it too as she clung to me while I tried to force her out the door. Mika, look at me. Stay on the moose trail and go get Miss Kim. Tell her Mama's sick and then stay there until I come to get you." With that, I shut my baby sister outside and turned to face the cruel laughter behind me. "Sit down, Mommy, it'll be okay. Miss Kim is on her way, she'll help you." And then the third most terrifying thing in my life happened. Mom stopped laughing and grinned at me. Her pupils fully dilated, making her eyes look solid black.
"Aren't you going to run away too, little girl? What if the wolves and foxes get the little one?"
Her voice was impossibly deep. I may have considered it a pleasant voice to listen to scary stories from, if it hadn't have been coming from my mother's mouth. She just laughed and laughed. By the time Miss Kim got to us, Mom had dissolved into a sobbing puddle on the floor. Miss Kim said my mom was just having another migraine, that she was just confused, that surely Mom had tried to call Miss Kim herself, but with a bad case of migraine fever had simply misplaced the phone and we'd definitely find it later. I expected Mom to be in her cave of a bedroom for a few days after her episode, so Mika and I went about our normal school routine. I was laying on the back of the floor reading some subject or another when I heard Mika gasp. "Mama, are you all better?" she asked innocently. "Mama feels better. Sissy got me medicine in time yesterday. Did I scare you? I'm sorry." I was surprised to see her up and about. I was shocked when she opened up all the blinds and let light into the room. I was overjoyed when she gathered us up in a big hug and gave us a squeeze. It was going to be a great day. All I had to worry about was math. I hated math. I was wrong. Again. After we finished our morning schoolwork, which included a round of Mom and Mika singing catchy songs about vowels, Mika went to take a nap before lunch. I remember I was sitting at my little desk trying my best to ace a math test. I was concentrating so hard that I hadn't noticed how still the room had become. I couldn't hear my mom in the kitchen whipping up lunch anymore. It was so quiet. Even now, decades later, the mere thought of how that silence felt opens a pit in my stomach. I'm not sure how I got my feet to carry me into the kitchen, when everything in my little body was screaming not to. She wasn't there. She wasn't in the dining room either. My heart pounding so hard, I could hear the blood pumping through my body. It's so loud in the quiet of the house. Mika? Oh my God, Mika. Rushing to our shared bedroom, I noticed the door leading into the garage was slightly open. It's funny the small details that stick with you. I should have shut that dang door and locked it. I sometimes wonder what would have happened had I slammed it shut, but I didn't. I paused for the briefest of seconds and heard a deep chuckle from the darkness of the garage. It was different this time. It was evil. Mika was still sound asleep when I charged into the room. After shutting the door, I paced back and forth. What felt like hours while I attempted to figure out a plan was probably only seconds. The coat closet was right next to the garage door. I'd never get Mika bundled and out without incident. There was only one choice. I shook her awake. Mika, shh. A monster got into the house. Her big blue eyes filled with fear and tears. I need you to hide. She looked towards the closet and back at me. I nodded. We buried her under blankets and toys. Don't come out of the closet, Mika. Don't even make a noise or the monster will get you. But Sissy, what about you? Don't come out of the closet, Mika. It can't come into the closet. Once again I shut her out, leaving my sweet baby sister to be brave all by herself. The monster was waiting for me when I left the room. Smile too big, eyes too dark. Do you want to take your medicine, Mom?
You should come eat your lunch, girl. I made it special for you.
I followed her back to the kitchen. I should stop and mention that there was one other family member that I've neglected to bring up. She was a mean old cat named Socks. No, the monster didn't turn Socks into lunch. Socks was a horrible pet. She hated everyone. She didn't even like to be petted. I think her only joy in life was seeing how much she could make me bleed, or how loud I'd shout when she'd come at me yowling with her claws out. She went unseen most of the time, but now, for whatever reason, that dastardly cat decided to show her face. Socks was sitting square in the middle of the kitchen looking more irritable than usual. Mother hissed at her. She actually hissed, spittle flying and everything. Panic spread across her face and she shoved me away from her. My brain chose this moment to register the fact that my mother was holding a carving knife in one hand. Our eyes locked and hers became clear again. She looked at me with such sadness and agony as she placed the blade against her wrist. No! I dove for the knife and tried to wrestle it away. In that moment, the second most scary thing in my life happened. Mother's eyes went dark. The too wide smile returned, and the tip of the blade pushed into my chest, right above my heart. It hurt. It was like I was being burned and flash frozen in one spot all at the same time. I thought for sure this was the end, but she just let go and the knife clattered to the floor. Socks growled. The monster turned, left the kitchen and sat on the living room floor. My mom was still in there. I saw her. Just a flash of those bright blue eyes. She was in there fighting to come back. As much as I wanted to run, I couldn't just leave her. She had been willing to try to sacrifice herself to keep us safe. I looked at the blade on the floor, the small cut on my chest, and the crazy cat thumping her tail on the linoleum. I went and sat with the monster. It grinned at me.
Are you afraid, girl?
Was I afraid? Of course I was freaking scared. My mom had just tried to slash her wrist in front of me and then tried to stab me and was now talking to me with a voice much too deep and husky to be her own. I had no clue how I had managed not to pee my pants yet, but there was no way in heck I was going to let this thing know that. No. The monster screamed. It was both the deep bass of a man and the voice of my mom. I could hear her screaming. The monster's voice almost drowned her out, but she was there. It broke my heart into 1,000 tiny pieces to hear her scream like that.
Are you scared now?
Socks sauntered up to the monster and sat beside her. No. The monster was furious. I could see my death in the black orbs of its eyes. I could feel its hatred of me rolling off of it in waves. You aren't supposed to look at your mom and see these things. It's not good for an 11-year-old girl's soul. But while we stared each other down, I saw her hand creep toward Socks. That dang cat did something I would never have expected. She butted her head up and under my mom's hand. The second those long, graceful fingers touched Sock's fur, Mom came back. Blue eyes wide and filled with terror. That's when the scariest thing in my life happened. Mom opened her mouth, and with her own voice said one single word. Run. Okay, I've never done this before, but here it goes. This happened to me on Halloween night, 2015. It was my favorite holiday of the year, and it was finally here. My first Halloween without being chaperoned by a parent. We live in a pretty wooded area, but houses are scattered about here and there. I dressed as the stranger from the video game Until Dawn. My friend dressed as a zombie, and my little brother dressed as the Pyro from Team Fortress 2. My friend and I were the age 13 at the time, and my little brother being 12. We were so excited to go alone for the first time. We waited until 9 p.m., so it was plenty dark, and added to that creepy feeling of going alone. We began going down our dirt road to the barely lit street, making a right towards the houses. We trick-or-treated for a while and were almost satisfied with the amount of candy in our bags. We never get that much candy anyway because of the limit of houses, and decided to walk back home. We were about halfway home when my friend nudged my shoulder and pointed at something at the edge of the forest. It was a dark figure just standing still. I thought it was a tree at first, but I could see the outline of it from the light of the street lamp. We got a little creeped out, but continued walking. A little ways up, I heard a rustle in the bushes, and I'm pretty sure we all heard it, because my little brother and my friend were both looking at me with that what the heck kind of look. We all turned around and saw the man closer this time, at the edge of the forest looking like he was trying to hide behind a tree. We all started walking faster, trying to get away from him. After all, we were almost home. About 3 minutes later, we heard another rustle, and we all turned around quickly only to see, you freaking guessed it, the same man standing there. We all just stood there watching him, giving him that we freaking see you look. But then we heard something that made our spines shiver. We heard another rustle to see another outline of a person beside him. We all knew we were going to die or worse if we didn't get out of there. We turned around and bolted towards my house, taking hard breaths as we did. I glanced behind me only to see 2 men gaining on us, but staying on the edge of the forest, not crossing into the road. As soon as my house was in sight, we all bolted to the woods beside it to try to get into the back door, hoping they wouldn't know where we lived. We made it through the sticks and branches in our way, and ran up the wooden steps into our house. We burst the glass sliding door open and locked it. My mom asked what was going on, and we explained while my dad called the police. That night ruined trick-or-treating for me, so now I stay home with my friends and just watch a scary movie. To everyone out there going alone trick-or-treating, make sure you have a phone or a friend with you. I made the mistake of not bringing a phone, which could have made the situation a lot worse if they caught up to us.